Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874 at his family's ancestral home, Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. On his father's side, he was a member of the British aristocracy as a direct descendant of John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, representing the Conservative Party, had been elected Member of Parliament, MP, for Woodstock in 1874. His mother, Jenny, was a daughter of Leonard Jerome, a wealthy American businessman. In 1876, Churchill's paternal grandfather, John Spencer Churchill, 7th Duke of Marlborough, was appointed Viceroy of Ireland, then part of the United Kingdom. Randolph became his private secretary, and the family relocated to Dublin. Winston's brother Jack was born there in 1880. Throughout much of the 1880s, Randolph and Jenny were effectively estranged, and the brothers were mostly cared for by their nanny, Elizabeth Everest. When she died in 1895, Churchill wrote that she had been my dearest and most intimate friend during the whole of the 20 years I had lived. Churchill began boarding at St. George's School in Ascot, Berkshire, at age 7, but was not academic, and his behaviour was poor. In 1884, he transferred to Brunswick School in Hove, where his academic performance improved. In April 1888, age 13, he narrowly passed the entrance exam for Harrow School. His father wanted him to prepare for a military career, and so his last 3 years at Harrow were in the army form. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to gain admittance to the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, he succeeded on his 3rd. He was accepted as a cadet in the cavalry, starting in September 1893. His father died in January 1895, a month after Churchill graduated from Sandhurst. In February 1895, Churchill was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars Regiment of the British Army, based at Aldershot. Eager to witness military action, he used his mother's influence to get himself posted to a war zone. In the autumn of 1895, he and his friend Reggie Barnes, then a subaltern, went to Cuba to observe the War of Independence and became involved in skirmishes after joining Spanish troops attempting to suppress independence fighters. Churchill sent reports about the conflict to the Daily Graphic in London. With the Hussars, he went to Bombay in October 1896. Based in Bangalore, he was in India for 19 months, visiting Calcutta 3 times and joining expeditions to Hyderabad and the northwest frontier. In India, Churchill began a self-education project, reading a range of authors including Plato, Edward Gibbon, Charles Darwin, and Thomas Babington Macaulay. The books were sent to him by his mother, with whom he shared frequent correspondence when abroad. In order to learn about politics, he also asked his mother to send him copies of the Annual Register, the political almanac. Churchill volunteered to join Bindon Blood's Malakand Field Force in its campaign against Mohmand rebels in the Swat Valley of northwest India. Blood accepted him on condition that he was assigned as a journalist, the beginning of Churchill's writing career. He returned to Bangalore in October 1897 and there wrote his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, which received positive reviews. He also wrote his only work of fiction, Savrola, a Ruritanian romance. To keep himself fully occupied, Churchill embraced writing as what Roy Jenkins calls his whole habit, especially through his political career when he was out of office. Writing was his main safeguard against recurring depression, which he referred to as his black dog. Using his contacts in London, Churchill got himself attached to General Kitchener's campaign in the Sudan as a 21st Lancers subaltern, while additionally working as a journalist for the Morning Post. After fighting in the Battle of Omdurman on the 2nd of September 1898, the 21st Lancers were stood down. In October, Churchill returned to England and began writing The River War, an account of the campaign which was published in November 1899. It was at this time that he decided to leave the army. He was critical of Kitchener's actions during the war, particularly the latter's unmerciful treatment of enemy wounded and his desecration of Muhammad Ahmad's tomb in Omdurman. On the 2nd of December 1898, Churchill embarked for India to settle his military business and complete his resignation from the 4th Hussars. He spent a lot of his time there playing polo, the only ball sport in which he was ever interested. Having left the Hussars, he sailed from Bombay on the 20th of March 1899 determined to launch a career in politics. Seeking a parliamentary career, Churchill spoke at Conservative meetings and was selected as one of the party's 2 parliamentary candidates for the June 1899 by-election in Oldham, Lancashire. While campaigning in Oldham, Churchill referred to himself as a Conservative and a Tory Democrat. Although the Oldham seats had previously been held by the Conservatives, the result was a narrow Liberal victory. Anticipating the outbreak of the Second Boer War between Britain and the Boer republics, Churchill sailed to South Africa as a journalist for the Morning Post under the editorship of James Nichol Dunn. In October, he travelled to the conflict zone near Ladysmith, then besieged by Boer troops, before heading for Colenso. After his train was derailed by Boer artillery shelling, he was captured as a prisoner of war, POW, and interned in a Boer POW camp in Pretoria. In December, Churchill escaped from the prison and evaded his captors by stowing away aboard freight trains and hiding in a mine. He eventually made it to safety in Portuguese East Africa. His escape attracted much publicity. In January 1900, he briefly rejoined the army as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse Regiment, joining Redvers Buller's fight to relieve the siege of Ladysmith and take Pretoria. He was among the first British troops into both places. He and his cousin Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, demanded and received the surrender of 52 Boer prison camp guards. Throughout the war, he had publicly chastised anti-Boer prejudices, calling for them to be treated with generosity and tolerance, and after the war, he urged the British to be magnanimous in victory. In July, having resigned his lieutenancy, he returned to Britain. His Morning Post dispatches had been published as London to Ladysmith via Pretoria and had sold well. Churchill rented a flat in London's Mayfair, using it as his base for the next 6 years. He stood again as one of the Conservative candidates at Oldham in the October 1900 general election, securing a narrow victory to become a Member of Parliament at age 25. In the same month, he published Ian Hamilton's March, a book about his South African experiences, which became the focus of a lecture tour in November through Britain, America, and Canada. Members of Parliament were unpaid, and the tour was a financial necessity. In America, Churchill met Mark Twain, President McKinley, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. He did not get on well with Roosevelt. Later, in spring 1901, he gave more lectures in Paris, Madrid, and Gibraltar. As a liberal, Churchill attacked government policy and gained a reputation as a radical under the influences of John Morley and David Lloyd George. In December 1905, Balfour resigned as Prime Minister, and King Edward VII invited the Liberal leader Henry Campbell Bannerman to take his place. Hoping to secure a working majority in the House of Commons, Campbell Bannerman called a general election in January 1906, which the Liberals won. Churchill won the Manchester North West seat. In the same month, his biography of his father was published. He received an advance payment of £8,000. It was generally well received. It was also at this time that the first biography of Churchill himself, written by the Liberal Alexander MacCallum Scott, was published. In private life, Churchill proposed marriage to Clementine Hozier. They were married on the 12th of September, 1908 at St. Margaret S. Westminster, and honeymooned in Baveno, Venice, and Vevery Castle in Moravia. They lived at 33 Eccleston Square, London, and their first daughter, Diana, was born in July 1909. Churchill and Clementine were married for over 56 years until his death. The success of his marriage was important to Churchill's career, as Clementine's unbroken affection provided him with a secure and happy background. In October 1911, Asquith appointed Churchill First Lord of the Admiralty, and he took up official residence at Admiralty House. He created a naval war staff, and over the next 2.5 years focused on naval preparation, visiting naval stations and dockyards, seeking to improve morale and scrutinizing German naval developments. After the German government passed its 1912 naval law to increase warship production, Churchill vowed that Britain would do the same, and that for every new battleship built by the Germans, Britain would build 2. He invited Germany to engage in a mutual de-escalation of naval building projects, but this was refused. As First Lord, Churchill was tasked with overseeing Britain's naval effort when the First World War began in August 1914. In the same month, the Navy transported 120,000 British troops to France and began a blockade of Germany's North Sea ports. Churchill sent submarines to the Baltic Sea to assist the Russian Navy, and he sent the Marine Brigade to Ostend, forcing a reallocation of German troops. In September, Churchill assumed full responsibility for Britain's aerial defence. On the 7th of October, Clementine gave birth to their third child, Sarah. In October, Churchill visited Antwerp to observe Belgian defences against the besieging Germans and promised British reinforcements for the city. Soon afterward, however, Antwerp fell to the Germans, and Churchill was criticised in the press. He maintained that his actions had prolonged resistance and enabled the Allies to secure Calais and Dunkirk. In November, Asquith called a war council, consisting of himself, Lloyd George, Edward Grey, Kitchener, and Churchill. Churchill set the development of the tank on the right track and financed its creation with Admiralty funds. Churchill was interested in the Middle Eastern theatre and wanted to relieve Turkish pressure on the Russians in the Caucasus by staging attacks against Turkey in the Dardanelles. He hoped that, if successful, the British could even seize Constantinople. Approval was given, and in March 1915, an Anglo-French task force attempted a naval bombardment of Turkish defences in the Dardanelles. In April, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, including the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, began its assault at Gallipoli. Both campaigns failed, and Churchill was held by many MPs, particularly Conservatives, to be personally responsible. In May, Asquith agreed under parliamentary pressure to form an all-party coalition government, but the Conservatives' one condition of entry was that Churchill must be removed from the Admiralty. Churchill pleaded his case with both Asquith and Conservative leader Bonar Law, but had to accept demotion and became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Churchill, despite remaining a Member of Parliament, resigned from the government on November 25, 1915. Asquith rejected his request to be appointed the British East Africa General Governor. Deciding to join the army, Churchill joined the 2nd Grenadier Guards on the Western Front. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in January 1916 and given command of the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers. After receiving training, the battalion was moved to a section near Ploegsteert in the Belgium front. Despite no German attacks for over 3 months, they were constantly under bombardment. Churchill narrowly escaped death when a large shell fragment fell among them during a visit from his cousin, the aide-de-camp to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. In May, the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers were amalgamated into the 15th Division. Churchill did not request a new command, but instead obtained leave from active service. Upon his return to the House of Commons, Churchill spoke on matters related to the war, calling for the extension of conscription to include the Irish, greater recognition of soldiers' bravery, and the introduction of steel helmets for soldiers. In October 1916, Asquith resigned as Prime Minister and was succeeded by Lloyd George, who in May 1917 sent Churchill to inspect the French war effort. In July, Churchill was appointed Minister of Munitions. He quickly negotiated an end to a strike in munitions factories along the Clyde and increased munitions production. It was in his October 1917 letter to the attention of his cabinet colleagues that he penned the plan of attack for the next year that would bring final victory to the Allies. He ended a second strike, in June 1918, by threatening to conscript strikers into the army. In the House of Commons, Churchill voted in support of the Representation of the People Act, 1918, which gave some British women the right to vote. In November 1918, 4 days after the armistice, Churchill's 4th child, Marigold, was born. With the war over, Lloyd George called a general election with voting on Saturday, the 14th of December 1918. During the election campaign, Churchill called for the nationalisation of the railways, a control on monopolies, tax reform, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. He was returned as MP for Dundee and although the Conservatives won a majority, Lloyd George was retained as Prime Minister. In January 1919, Lloyd George moved Churchill to the War Office as both Secretary of State for War and Secretary of State for Air. Churchill was responsible for demobilizing the British Army, although he convinced Lloyd George to keep 1 million men conscripted for the British Army of the Rhine. Churchill was one of the few government figures who opposed harsh measures against defeated Germany, and he cautioned against demobilizing the German army, warning that they might be needed as a bulwark against threats from the newly established Soviet Russia. He was an outspoken opponent of Vladimir Lenin's new Communist Party government in Russia. He initially supported the use of British troops to assist the anti-communist White forces in the Russian Civil War, but soon recognized the desire of the British people to bring them home. After the Soviets won the Civil War, Churchill proposed a cordon sanitaire around the country. In the Irish War of Independence, he supported the use of the paramilitary Black and Tans to combat Irish revolutionaries. After British troops in Iraq clashed with Kurdish rebels, Churchill authorized 2 squadrons to the area, proposing that they be equipped with poison gas to be used to inflict punishment upon recalcitrant natives without inflicting grave injury upon them, although this was never implemented. There is debate as to whether this would have included mustard gas or otherwise lacrimatory gas, tear gas. More broadly, he saw the occupation of Iraq as a drain on Britain and proposed unsuccessfully that the government should hand control of central and northern Iraq back to Turkey. Churchill became the Secretary of State for the Colonies in February 1921. The following month, his first art exhibition was held. In Paris, he presented a show under a pseudonym. In May, his mother passed away, followed by the arrival of his daughter Marigold in August. Churchill engaged in negotiations with Sinn Féin leaders and assisted in the preparation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Elsewhere, he was responsible for reducing the cost of occupying the Middle East and played a role in the placements of his brother, King Faisal in Iraq, and his brother Abdullah in Jordan. As a supporter of Zionism, Churchill went to Mandatory Palestine and rejected an Arab-Palestinian petition to ban Jewish migration to Palestine. After the 1921 Jaffa riots, he allowed some temporary restrictions. In September 1922, the Chanak crisis erupted as Turkish forces threatened to occupy the Dardanelles neutral zone, which was policed by the British Army based in Chanak, now Kanakkale. Churchill and Lloyd George favored military resistance to any Turkish advance, but the majority Conservatives in the coalition government opposed it. A political debacle ensued, which resulted in the Conservative withdrawal from the government, precipitating the November 1922 general election. Also in September, Churchill's 5th and last child, Mary, was born, and in the same month, he purchased Chartwell in Kent, which became his family home for the rest of his lifetime. In October 1922, he underwent an operation for appendicitis. While he was in the hospital, Lloyd George's coalition was dissolved. In the general election, Churchill lost his Dundee seat to Edwin Scrymgeour, a prohibitionist candidate. Later he wrote that he was without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. Still, he could be satisfied with his elevation as one of 50 companions of honour, as named in Lloyd George's 1922 Dissolution Honours List. Churchill spent much of the next 6 months at the Villa Rêve d'Or near Cannes, where he devoted himself to painting and writing his memoirs. He wrote an autobiographical history of the war, The World Crisis. The first volume was published in April 1923, and the rest over the next 10 years. After the 1923 general election was called, 7 Liberal associations asked Churchill to stand as their candidate, and he selected Leicester West, but he did not win the seat. A Labour government led by Ramsay MacDonald took power. Churchill had hoped they would be defeated by a Conservative Liberal coalition. He strongly opposed the MacDonald government's decision to loan money to Soviet Russia and feared the signing of an Anglo-Soviet treaty. On the 19th of March 1924, alienated by Liberal support for Labour, Churchill stood as an independent anti-socialist candidate in the Westminster Abbey by-election, but was defeated. In May, he addressed a Conservative meeting in Liverpool and declared that there was no longer a place for the Liberal Party in British politics. He said that Liberals must back the Conservatives to stop Labour and ensure the successful defeat of socialism. In July, he agreed with Conservative leader Stanley Baldwin that he would be selected as a Conservative candidate in the next general election, which was held on the 29th of October. Churchill stood at Epping, but he described himself as a constitutionalist. The Conservatives were victorious, and Baldwin formed the new government. Although Churchill had no background in finance or economics, Baldwin appointed him as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Becoming Chancellor on the 6th of November 1924, Churchill formally rejoined the Conservative Party. As Chancellor, he intended to pursue his free trade principles in the form of laissez-faire economics, as under the liberal social reforms. In April 1925, he controversially, albeit reluctantly, restored the gold standard in his first budget at its 1914 parity against the advice of some leading economists, including John Maynard Keynes. The return to gold is held to have caused deflation and resultant unemployment with a devastating impact on the coal industry. Churchill presented 5 budgets in all to April 1929. Among his measures were reduction of the state pension age from 70 to 65, immediate provision of widows' pensions, reduction of military expenditure, income tax reductions, and imposition of taxes on luxury items. During the general strike of 1926, Churchill edited the British Gazette, the government's anti-strike propaganda newspaper. After the strike ended, he acted as an intermediary between striking miners and their employers. He later called for the introduction of a legally binding minimum wage. In early 1927, Churchill visited Rome, where he met Mussolini, whom he praised for his stand against Leninism. After Hitler came to power on the 30th of January 1933, Churchill was quick to recognize the menace of such a regime and expressed alarm that the British government had reduced Air Force spending and warned that Germany would soon overtake Britain in Air Force production. Armed with official data provided clandestinely by 2 senior civil servants, Desmond Morton and Ralph Wigram, Churchill was able to speak with authority about what was happening in Germany, especially the development of the Luftwaffe. He told the people of his concerns in a radio broadcast in November 1934, "Say, many people think that the best way to escape war is to dwell upon its horrors and to imprint them vividly upon the minds of the younger generation. They flaunt the grisly photograph before their eyes. They fill their ears with tales of carnage. They dilate upon the ineptitude of generals and admirals. They denounce the crime as insensate folly of human strife. Now all this teaching ought to be very useful in preventing us from attacking or invading any other country if anyone outside a madhouse wished to do so. But how would it help us if we were attacked or invaded ourselves? That is the question we have to ask. Would the invaders consent to hear Lord Beaverbrook's exposition or listen to the impassioned appeals of Mr. Lloyd George? Would they agree to meet that famous South African, General Smuts, and have their inferiority complex removed in friendly, reasonable debate? I doubt it. I have borne responsibility for the safety of this country in grievous times. I gravely doubt it. But even if they did, I am not so sure we should convince them and persuade them to go back quietly home. They might say, it seems to me, you are rich, we are poor. You seem well fed, we are hungry. You have been victorious, we have been defeated. You have valuable colonies, we have none. You have your navy, where is ours? You have had the past, let us have the future. Above all, I fear they would say, you are weak and we are strong. After all, my friends, only a few hours away by air there dwell a nation of nearly 70 millions of the most educated, industrious, scientific, disciplined people in the world, who are being taught from childhood to think of war as a glorious exercise and death in battle as the noblest fate for man. There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective strength. There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion. In that country, all pacifist speeches, all morbid war books are forbidden or suppressed, and their authors rigorously imprisoned. From their new table of commandments they have omitted, "Thou shalt not kill." It is but 20 years since these neighbours of ours fought almost the whole world and almost defeated them. Now they are rearming with the utmost speed, and ready to their hands is the new lamentable weapon of the air, against which our navy is no defence, and before which women and children, the weak and frail, the pacifist and the jingo, the warrior and the civilian, the front-line trenches and the cottage home, all lie in equal and impartial peril. Nay, worse still, for with the new weapon has come a new method, or rather has come back the most British method of ancient barbarism, namely, the possibility of compelling the submission of nations by terrorizing their civil population. And worst of all, the more civilized the country is, the larger and more splendid its cities, the more intricate the structure of its civil and economic life, the more is it vulnerable and at the mercy of those who may make it their prey. Now these are facts, hard, grim, indisputable facts, and in the face of these facts I ask again, what are we to do? Between October 1933 and September 1938, the 4 volumes of Marlborough, His Life and Times, were published and sold well. In December 1934, the India Bill entered Parliament and was passed in February 1935. Churchill and 83 other Conservative MPs voted against it. In June 1935, MacDonald resigned and was succeeded as Prime Minister by Baldwin. Baldwin then led the Conservatives to victory in the 1935 general election. Churchill retained his seat with an increased majority, but was again left out of the government. In January 1936, Edward VIII succeeded his father, George V, as monarch. His desire to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, caused the abdication crisis. Churchill supported Edward and clashed with Baldwin on the issue. Afterwards, although Churchill immediately pledged loyalty to George VI, he wrote that the abdication. On the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Chamberlain reappointed Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, and he joined Chamberlain's War Cabinet. Churchill later claimed that the Board of the Admiralty sent a signal to the fleet, "Winston is back." As First Lord, Churchill was one of the highest-profile ministers during the so-called phony war, when the only significant action by British forces was at sea. Churchill was ebullient after the Battle of the River Plate on the 13th of December 1939, and afterward welcomed home the crews, congratulating them on a brilliant sea fight and saying that their actions in a cold, dark winter had warmed the cockles of the British heart. On the 16th of February 1940, Churchill personally ordered Captain Philip Vian of the destroyer HMS Cossack to board the German supply ship Altmark in Norwegian waters, freeing 299 British merchant seamen who had been captured by the Admiral Graf Spee. These actions, supplemented by his speeches, considerably enhanced Churchill's reputation. He was concerned about German naval activity in the Baltic Sea and initially wanted to send a naval force there, but this was soon changed to a plan, codenamed Operation Wilfred, to mine Norwegian waters and stop iron ore shipments from Narvik to Germany. There were disagreements about mining, both in the War Cabinet and with the French government. As a result, Wilfred was delayed until the 8th of April 1940, the day before the German invasion of Norway was launched. After the Allies failed to prevent the German occupation of Norway, the Commons held an open debate from 7 to the 9th of May on the government's conduct of the war. This has come to be known as the Norway debate and is renowned as one of the most significant events in parliamentary history. On the second day, Wednesday the 8th of May, the Labour opposition called for a division which was in effect a vote of no confidence in Chamberlain's government. There was considerable support for Churchill on both sides of the House, but as a member of the government, he was obliged to speak on its behalf. He was called upon to wind up the debate, which placed him in the difficult position of having to defend the government without damaging his own prestige. Although the government won the vote, its majority was drastically reduced amid calls for a national government to be formed. In the early hours of the 10th of May, German forces invaded Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands as a prelude to their assault on France. Since the division vote, Chamberlain had been trying to form a coalition, but Labour declared on the Friday afternoon that they would not serve under his leadership, although they would accept another Conservative. The only two candidates were Churchill and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary. The matter had already been discussed at a meeting on the 9th between Chamberlain, Halifax, Churchill, and David Margesson, the government chief whip. Halifax admitted that he could not govern effectively as a member of the House of Lords, and so Chamberlain advised the king to send for Churchill, who became Prime Minister. Churchill later wrote of feeling a profound sense of relief in that he now had authority over the whole scene. He believed himself to be walking with destiny, and that his life so far had been a preparation for this hour and for this trial. In May, Churchill was still generally unpopular with many Conservatives, and probably most of the Labour Party. Chamberlain remained Conservative Party leader until October, when ill health forced his resignation. By that time, Churchill had won the doubters over, and his succession as party leader was a formality. He began his premiership by forming a five-man war cabinet, which included Chamberlain as Lord President of the Council, Labour leader Clement Attlee as Lord Privy Seal, later as Deputy Prime Minister, Halifax as Foreign Secretary, and Labour's Arthur Greenwood as a minister without portfolio. In practice, these five were augmented by the service chiefs and ministers who attended the majority of meetings. The cabinet changed in size and membership as the war progressed, one of the key appointments being the leading trades unionist Ernest Bevin as Minister of Labour and National Service. In response to previous criticisms that there had been no clear single minister in charge of the prosecution of the war, Churchill created and assumed the additional position of Minister of Defence, making him the most powerful wartime Prime Minister in British history. He drafted outside experts into government to fulfil vital functions, especially on the home front. These included personal friends like Lord Beaverbrook and Frederick Lindemann, who became the government's scientific advisor. Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union on Sunday, the 22nd of June 1941. It was no surprise to Churchill, who had known since early April, from Enigma decrypts at Bletchley Park, that the attack was imminent. He had tried to warn General Secretary Joseph Stalin via the British ambassador to Moscow, Stafford Cripps, but to no avail as Stalin did not trust Churchill. The night before the attack, already intending an address to the nation, Churchill alluded to his hitherto anti-communist views by saying to Colville, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil." In August 1941, Churchill made his first transatlantic crossing of the war on board HMS Prince of Wales and met Roosevelt in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. On the 14th of August, they issued the joint statement that has become known as the Atlantic Charter. This outlined the goals of both countries for the future of the world, and it is seen as the inspiration for the 1942 Declaration by United Nations, itself the basis of the United Nations, which was founded in June 1945. From the 30th of January to the 2nd of February 1945, Churchill and Roosevelt met for their Malta Conference ahead of the second Big Three event at Yalta from 4 to the 11th of February. Yalta had massive implications for the post-war world. There were two predominant issues: the question of setting up the United Nations organization after the war, on which much progress was made, and the more vexed question of Poland's post-war status, which Churchill saw as a test case for the future of Eastern Europe. Churchill faced some strong criticism for the Yalta Agreement on Poland. For example, 27 Tory MPs voted against him when the matter was debated in the Commons at the end of the month. Jenkins, however, maintains that Churchill did as well as he could have done in very difficult circumstances, not least the fact that Roosevelt was seriously ill and could not provide Churchill with meaningful support. Another outcome of Yalta was the so-called Operation Keelhaul. The Western Allies agreed to the forcible repatriation of all Soviet citizens in the Allied zones, including prisoners of war, to the Soviet Union, and the policy was later extended to all Eastern European refugees, many of whom were anti-communist. Keelhaul was implemented between the 14th of August 1946 and the 9th of May 1947. On the 7th of May 1945 at the SHAEF headquarters in Reims, the Allies accepted Germany's surrender. The next day was Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, when Churchill broadcast to the nation that Germany had surrendered and that a final ceasefire on all fronts in Europe would come into effect at 1 minute past midnight that night on the 9th of May. Afterwards, Churchill went to Buckingham Palace, where he appeared on the balcony with the royal family before a huge crowd of celebrating citizens. He went from the palace to Whitehall, where he addressed another large crowd. God bless you all. This is your victory. In our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their best. At this point, he asked Ernest Bevin to come forward and share the applause. Bevin said, "No, Winston, this is your day," and proceeded to conduct the people in the singing of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." In the evening, Churchill made another broadcast to the nation, asserting that the defeat of Japan would follow in the coming months. The Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August 1945. Churchill mishandled his election campaign by resorting to party politics and attempting to discredit the Labour Party. On June 4th, during a radio broadcast, he committed a serious political blunder by suggesting the need for some kind of Gestapo to implement the agenda of a Labour Party government. It backfired badly, and Attlee capitalised on it the next day in his response, saying, "The voice we heard last night was Mr. Churchill's, but the mind was Lord Beaverbrook's." Jenkins claims that this broadcast was Attlee-made. Despite the election day being July 5th, the results were not known until July 26th due to the need to collect votes from those serving abroad. Clementine and their daughter Mary were in Woodford, Churchill's new electoral district in Essex, for the count, and they returned to Downing Street to meet him for lunch. While major parties in Woodford did not oppose Churchill, the majority over an independent candidate was much less than expected. In the afternoon, Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, who later wrote about it in his book The Struggle for Survival, discussed with him the ingratitude of the British people, and Churchill responded, "I wouldn't put it that way. It was very difficult times." Despite having personal support from the British public, he resigned from the premiership that evening after losing the election. Attlee, who formed the first majority Labour Party government, succeeded him. Churchill's defeat had various reasons attributed to it, including the widespread desire for post-war reforms among the public and the perception that the man who led Britain in wartime was not seen as the one to lead the nation in peace. Despite losing the popular vote to Labour, the Conservatives won an overall majority of 17 seats in the October 1951 general election, and Churchill again became Prime Minister, remaining in office until his resignation on the 5th of April 1955. Eden, his eventual successor, was restored to Foreign Affairs, the portfolio with which Churchill was preoccupied throughout his tenure. Future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was appointed Minister of Housing and Local Government, with a manifesto commitment to build 300,000 new houses per annum, Churchill's only real domestic concern. He achieved the target, and in October 1954 was promoted to Minister of Defence. Churchill was nearly 77 when he took office, and was not in good health following several minor strokes. By December 1951, George VI had become concerned about Churchill's decline and intended asking him to stand down in favour of Eden, but the king had his own serious health issues and died on the 6th of February 1952 without making the request. Churchill developed a close friendship with Elizabeth II, and in the spring of 1953 he accepted the Order of the Garter at her request. He was knighted as Sir Winston on the 24th of April 1953. It was widely expected that he would retire after the Queen's coronation in June 1953, but after Eden became seriously ill, Churchill increased his own responsibilities by taking over at the Foreign Office. Eden was incapacitated until the end of the year and was never completely well again. On the evening of the 23rd of June 1953, Churchill suffered a serious stroke and became partially paralysed down one side. Had Eden been well, Churchill's premiership would most likely have been over. The matter was kept secret, and Churchill went home to Chartwell to recuperate. He had fully recovered by November. He retired as Prime Minister in April 1955 and was succeeded by Eden. Elizabeth II offered to create Churchill Duke of London, but he declined because of the objections of his son Randolph, who would have inherited the title on his father's death. Although publicly supportive, Churchill was privately scathing about Eden's handling of the Suez Crisis, and Clementine believed that many of his visits to the United States in the following years were attempts to help repair Anglo-American relations. After leaving the premiership, Churchill remained an MP until he stood down at the 1964 general election. Apart from 1922 to 1924, he had been an MP since October 1900 and had represented 5 constituencies. By the time of the 1959 general election, he seldom attended the House of Commons. Despite the Conservative landslide in 1959, his own majority in Woodford fell by more than 1,000. He spent most of his retirement at Chartwell or at his London home in Hyde Park Gate, and became a habitué of high society at La Pausa on the French Riviera. In June 1962, when he was 87, Churchill had a fall in Monte Carlo and broke his hip. He was flown home to a London hospital where he remained for 3 weeks. Jenkins says that Churchill was never the same after this accident, and his last 2 years were something of a twilight period. In 1963, US President John F. Kennedy, acting under authorization granted by an act of Congress, proclaimed him an honorary citizen of the United States, but he was unable to attend the White House ceremony. There has been speculation that he became very depressed in his final years, but this has been emphatically denied by his personal secretary Anthony Montague Brown, who was with him for his last 10 years. Montague Brown wrote that he never heard Churchill refer to depression, and certainly he did not suffer from it. Churchill suffered his final stroke on the 12th of January 1965 and died 12 days later on the 24th of January, the 70th anniversary of his father's death. Like the Duke of Wellington in 1852 and William Gladstone in 1898, Churchill was given a state funeral. Planning for this had begun in 1953 under the code name of Operation Hope Not, and a detailed plan had been produced by 1958. His coffin lay in state at Westminster Hall for 3 days, and the funeral ceremony was at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 30th of January. Afterwards, the coffin was taken by boat along the River Thames to Waterloo Station, and from there by a special train to the family plot at St. Martin's Church, Blaydon, near his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. Worldwide, numerous memorials have been dedicated to Churchill. His statue in Parliament Square was unveiled by his widow Clementine in 1973 and is one of only 12 in the square, all of prominent political figures, including Churchill's friend Lloyd George and his India policy nemesis Gandhi. Elsewhere in London, the wartime Cabinet War Rooms have been renamed the Churchill Museum and Cabinet War Rooms. Churchill College, Cambridge, was established as a national memorial to Churchill. An indication of Churchill's high esteem in the UK is the result of the 2002 BBC poll, attracting 447,423 votes, in which he was voted the greatest Briton of all time, his nearest rival being Isambard Kingdom Brunel, some 56,000 votes behind. He is one of only 8 people to be granted honorary citizenship of the United States. Others include Lafayette, Raoul Wallenberg, and Mother Teresa. The United States Navy honored him in 1999 by naming a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer as the USS Winston S. Churchill. Other memorials in North America include the National Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri, where he made the 1946 Iron Curtain speech, Churchill Square in central Edmonton, Alberta, and the Winston Churchill Range, a mountain range northwest of Lake Louise, also in Alberta, which was renamed after Churchill in 1956. The Churchill Archives Centre on the campus of Churchill College, Cambridge, houses Churchill's personal papers and is open to the public.